For 4 years, Karen had not believed in happiness. Once, she had everything a woman could wish for: a loving and beloved husband, 3 wonderful children, a beautiful apartment in the city centre, exotic annual family vacations, and an expensive car. But everything changed abruptly when Garry died. Garry was returning home late at night after a long meeting at work. He never spared himself, understanding that he needed to provide for his large family. On that fateful night, Garry got behind the wheel, extremely exhausted. Their company was preparing for an important project, so the man had barely slept in the past few days. The road was empty, so at some point Garry relaxed and apparently lost his vigilance. He simply did not notice the danger approaching. At the intersection, a truck crashed into him at full speed. There was no chance of survival. Watching the footage from the road cameras, Karen understood that if Garry had slowed down even a fraction of a second before the intersection, the tragedy could have been avoided. The cause was inattention and fatigue, and, of course, the truck driver who arrogantly hoped to speed through the empty intersection on a red light. But there was no point in blaming anyone now. Garry wouldn't come back anyway. Karen could not accept what had happened for a long time. When the police called her, she was convinced that she had fallen victim to a telephone prank or scammers who extort money from gullible relatives by telling them that a family member is in trouble. Karen got to the morgue in 10 minutes, almost getting into an accident herself. She entered the building on unsteady legs. "This is nonsense," she tried to convince herself. "This is some kind of mistake. Garry is at work. It's not the first time he's been delayed."
"Mrs. McPhee?"
A policeman called out to her. "Where is he?" she asked. "May I see him?"
"Perhaps that's not the best idea,"
the man replied, somewhat embarrassed.
"You see, it was a terrible accident. Almost nothing was left of the car. And your husband... I called you now more for the identification of personal belongings. I don't think it's reasonable to conduct a body identification in your state."
Everything inside her went cold and tight. The policeman led the woman into a small room. Behind the desk sat another man. He lazily pulled out a drawer from the desk and took out a clear plastic bag containing items stained with red.
"Here, take a look."
The policeman began laying out the contents on the table.
"Do you recognize any of these items?"
Karen was about to say, without looking, that she was seeing all this for the first time, but then she noticed a golden pendant that she had given her husband for one of their wedding anniversaries. The woman reached out to the shiny rectangle, but her legs gave way. Everything in front of her eyes blurred.
"Yes, these are my husband's things," the woman said in a trembling voice. "We need to go to the station now, fill out the papers, and watch the footage from the surveillance cameras,"
the officer told her. Karen no longer cared. Her whole world had suddenly collapsed. What did some papers matter now? After the funeral, Karen became completely indifferent to what was happening around her. The nanny took care of the children, and Karen began to drink secretly. She did not react to the critical remarks of the housekeeper, who constantly found bottles in the trash. She locked herself in her room and spent hours looking at photographs of their once happy family. This went on for several months. Then, one day, Karen woke up on a frosty winter morning with a severe headache. She looked around at the mess surrounding her and cried. Only now did she finally realize that Garry would never again come into their bedroom, hug her, or call her to eat the pancakes he always made on weekends for breakfast for the whole family. Leaving the room, the woman made her way to the kitchen first thing in the morning. Everyone in the house was still asleep. The clock showed it was just past 7. Karen was determined to cook her husband's favourite dish. When the last pancake had migrated from the pan to the plate, Chilton came into the kitchen. The eldest daughter was 8, but was quite developed for her age. "Mummy," the girl was surprised, "did you make Daddy's pancakes?" Of all the children, she was the only one who realised that her father was gone. Andrew, who was only 5, cried for a long time, but could not understand what was happening. And Leela was just a baby and unable to perceive such information.
"Honey," Karen sighed heavily, "it won't be the same, but we're strong, aren't we? We'll try to cope somehow."
Chilton sat with a confused look. Looking at her mother, the girl could hardly believe her words. Her mum had lost a lot of weight. Always neat, stylish hair had turned into some kind of crow's nest. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were trembling.
"You know what?" Karen suddenly suggested. "Let's have a beauty day this morning, just the two of us."
They used to organise this kind of entertainment regularly. Therefore, hearing her mother's proposal, the daughter agreed without hesitation. While they were talking, Andrew and Leela entered the kitchen, accompanied by Mrs. Musser, the nanny. The boy carefully held his little sister by the hand, leading her like a princess.
"Mummy!"
the little ones shouted in unison, hugging her.
"My good ones," Karen smiled, hugging the little ones. "Good morning, Mrs. Musser."
"Good morning. I see you're in a good mood today," the nanny answered her warily. The woman's eyes were relieved. Lately she had been distressed about Karen. She had been working in their family for 8 years now, and during that time she had grown accustomed to everyone as if they were her own family, and to see Karen gradually fading away was unbearable. Mrs. Musser willingly moved in with them to help in some way and take on some of the responsibility of a hostess. The next day, Chilton and her mother went on their beauty expedition, as they called their visit to the salon. Karen was quickly tidied up, and Chilton had her charming braids braided, but there was a hitch at the reception. "The payment doesn't go through," the administrator said, smiling guiltily. "Let's do it again. It happens." When the payment failed several more times, Karen became seriously worried. Taking cash out of her purse, the woman paid. Getting into the car, she called the bank and reported the problem. "Mrs. McPhee," the employee answered her politely, "you see, the account to which your card is linked is frozen. I can't give you the details over the phone, so please come to the office." Karen never thought much about how much money was in it, knowing that her husband earned very well. "Of course, it's some kind of technical error," the woman convinced herself. "Now I'll go to the bank and find out everything." But the bank didn't say anything comforting. On the contrary, the situation was much worse. The account was arrested and blocked. Garry had some debts that Karen had no idea about. Suddenly, fear gripped Karen's throat. She didn't work. Having married a wealthy and promising man, the linguistics student initially did translations, dreaming of a career as an international translator, but her husband was categorical. "I can provide for you so that you want for nothing for the rest of your days." Karen never went to work, and then Chilton was born, and the woman devoted herself entirely to her family. If only Garry knew how everything would turn out. Now we're facing the end of days. Karen laughed bitterly. Of course, there was some cash at home, and she could sell the jewellery. That would be enough for a while. However, to her surprise, the money ran out at supersonic speed. The jewellery had been sold, and the contents of her husband's safe were quickly melting away. There was nothing left to do but to seek advice from Mrs. Musser. "Mrs. Musser," Karen began, quietly entering the kitchen, where the nanny was cooking something, "I need to talk to you. I have no more money." "What are you talking about, Karen?" The woman looked at her uncomprehendingly. "What do you mean you have no money? I always thought Garry earned enough to last your grandchildren a comfortable old age."
"That's how it was," Karen sighed. "But apparently he had some debts. Cosmic debts. I went to the bank. All the accounts are blocked. I've been spending cash from the safe for 2 months now, and I've sold almost all the jewellery."
"Karen, why didn't you tell me earlier? This is not a small problem," Mrs. Musser exclaimed in disbelief.
"It was awkward," Karen justified. "I never really knew how to count money. It was Garry's job. He never involved me in the affairs. It turns out that money has a way of running out, and now I don't know what to do. I'm at a loss." You need to find a job urgently while there's still time, Mrs. Musser declared resolutely. You have a good profession. Translators are always needed. But who will hire me? I graduated from university 10 years ago. I have no experience. Nothing. Never mind. Work on the internet. It seems to me that translations are always in demand. In any case, you won't know until you try. That's true, Karen sighed. Do you think they pay well? Well, good or bad, but it will be enough to live on. Of course, you'll have to tighten your belt, but it all depends on you. You understand that yourself. I won't leave you in trouble, but it's time to take control. A few months passed, and Karen had to sell her apartment to cover the remainder of the debt. Mummy? Andrew asked inquisitively when they entered into the new rented dwelling. Where is my room? Right here. You and Chilton will share this room, Karen said, opening the door to a small bedroom. We'll put the beds here, and the table and wardrobe will go there. No, Andrew whined. I don't want to share with Chilton. She's mean and greedy. I want to go back to my own room. Sweetheart, we'll be living here now. Look, the courtyard is so green, and you'll have your own tree, Karen said, trying to smile. She was referring to the large bird cherry tree whose branches nearly touched the window of the future children's room. Chilton entered the room, her face showing that she too was not thrilled with the new living arrangement. Mum, are we poor now? I'm not stupid. Tell me the truth. Karen led Chilton aside, not wanting Andrew to overhear and cause a scene. Sweetheart, she began, I don't want to lie to you. You're right, we don't have money anymore. That's how it is, and now we need to learn to live differently. I had to sell the apartment, and a lot of things will change, but the most important thing is that we stay together, right? Karen looked at her daughter, hopefully. Chilton's mind was racing, processing what she had heard and relating it to recent events. Suddenly her eyes lit up. And what about Mrs. Musser? Does this mean she won't be coming any more? Chilton asked, disappointed. Chilton, Karen hurried to reassure her. Mrs. Musser isn't going anywhere. She's like family to us. We'll just see her a little less often, because she'll have to work elsewhere. But she'll still visit us on weekends with Joy. Really? And who will take care of Leela and Andrew while I'm at school? Well, I'm working from home for now, and later we'll find a kindergarten, Karen replied with sincere belief. And are you ready to transfer to a new school? Mum, I understand everything. I'm not a little girl anymore, Chilton said seriously. Sometimes Karen was amazed at how maturely her daughter reasoned. They could no longer afford their old private school. Thankfully, she managed to enroll her child in a district school, which was considered excellent. But it was still a stressful change for a child accustomed to her classmates and the individualized approach of her teachers. As for Karen, she managed to find some work, but translations from French were not in high demand. Everywhere, specialists in Asian languages were needed, about which the former linguistics student had only a vague idea. Everything she managed to earn evaporated instantly. The little money left after paying off Garry's debts, Karen set aside for the most dire circumstances. There was still the car, but a woman with 3 children didn't want to give up her mobility, although maintaining the premium brand vehicle also cost a pretty penny. Attempts to officially find work as a translator in some international company failed. Seeing the effective, well-dressed applicant, managers were eager to invite her into their offices, but the lack of experience and 3 children in tow immediately turned them against her. After several such interviews, Karen gave up trying and made a living by occasional translations of contemporary French authors. The editor was in no hurry to flood her with orders, so the flow of money into the family did not turn into a raging torrent. 6 months after the move, Karen realized that the money was critically insufficient and sold her expensive car, exchanging it for a simpler model.
Then one day Mrs. Musser called. "Karen, my acquaintance is looking for an office manager. Why don't you come work for them? The job isn't demanding. They can't pay you a huge salary, but it comes with full benefits, normal weekends." "Of course I'll take it," Karen agreed without hesitation. That's how she ended up working at an office. Besides, this job left her enough time to work on translations, which added some money to her budget. Thus, somehow, Karen learned to live without her husband, making ends meet. 4 years passed. "Mum," Chilton announced once in the morning, "I know you haven't forgotten, but just a reminder, Andrew's birthday is this Sunday, and we haven't even bought him a present yet." "Chilton," Karen said as if waking up, "are you serious? This Sunday already? What's today's date?" "Mum, you're something else," Chilton marvelled. "Greetings to distant space travellers. Today on our planet is Thursday, September the 4th. The time is 1837. "Oh, darling, I'm all mixed up with the days." Karen seemed exhausted. Over the 4 years she had spent as a widow, much had changed in her life. She still worked at the same company, but now she was a personnel assistant instead of an office manager. Her salary increased, but she still struggled with financial issues. Chilton had grown into a teenager with increasing needs. Andrew was already in the 3rd grade, and Leela would start school next year. "Let's finish early tomorrow," Karen continued. "We'll go shopping and pick something interesting." Chilton disappeared through the door, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. September the 4th, she pondered, and in 2 days. It will be 4 years since Garry passed away. I should visit the cemetery. Karen visited her husband's grave once a year. She couldn't bear to go more often. Seeing his smiling face engraved on the black granite plaque was unbearable. She never took the children with her. Only once did Chilton accompany her, but seeing her daughter's tears was even more unbearable than the stone smile of her husband. Taking time off work early, Karen set off on her familiar route. There were no traffic jams yet, so Karen reached the cemetery quickly. Along the way, she stopped at a flower shop and bought 4 pristine white lilies, tied with a black satin ribbon. On a weekday, the cemetery was nearly deserted. Karen walked uncertainly, noting familiar landmarks from her previous visits. The ornate fence of some authority figure's grave, a sad little angel mourning a girl who had left the world at the age of 5. A trash bin topped with a pile of faded funeral wreaths. Spotting a blue spruce, the woman turned onto the path to the right. "Well, here I am," she said in a trembling voice, squatting down in front of the ever-smiling Garry. "I'm sorry I'm alone and haven't come for a long time, my love. I brought flowers. I know you didn't like them, but it's a tradition." With these words, Karen put the lilies in a jar with water, putting aside the dried remains of the ones from the last time. "And our children have grown up. Chilton is a real bride. You wouldn't even recognize her. She looks just like you. Here, take a look." With these words, the woman took out her phone and began to leaf through the photos of the children. "And Andrew is 9 now. Yesterday with Chilton, we went to choose a present for him. Your son is into airplane modelling. We bought him an airplane on batteries. Chilton says he'll jump to the ceiling when he sees it. And Leela's a year away to school. She's smart. She can read and write. Sometimes I even practice French with her." Karen sighed heavily, wiping away her tears with the palm of her hand. She didn't know what else to say to a dead person. "Well, everything is the same. I'm working at the same place. I don't make a lot of money, of course, but I have enough to live on. Mrs. Musser supports us a lot. She has retired and often takes the younger ones to her. She took them to a dacha all summer, teaching them to garden." For 15 minutes, Karen sat in complete silence, immersed in her memories. The birdsong immersed her in some meditative state. Suddenly, this calmness was broken by a crackling sound. Karen shuddered and looked around. Not far from her stood an old man in indecision, peering at her.
"Sorry to startle you,"
the elderly man addressed Karen in a peaceful tone.
You see, it's Thursday. There's no one here, and I'm lost again. How lucky I am that I met you. If you don't mind, would you kindly help me find my wife's grave? It's been years, and I keep getting lost in these gravestones. As if she didn't want me to see her like this."
The old man smiled embarrassedly. Yes, of course," agreed Karen, and lifted herself from the ground. "Well, Garry, goodbye. I'll go. I promise not to be discouraged. I'll hug our children for you." Karen went towards the old man with a tiny bouquet of lavender in his hands. Wow, she thought, I wonder where he found these flowers.
"My name is Mark Spitz,"
the elderly man introduced himself.
"and I see you are interested in my flowers."
"I'll be honest, yes. I didn't think you could find lavender in our town this time of year."
"I grow them in my own greenhouse. Leslie, my wife, was very fond of them. I still want to make her happy. Well, let's try to find the tombstone. It's weird and I can't find it. We are looking for a white gravestone, marble, not very high, and next to it a wrought iron bench. Helen Spitz."
Karen looked around, and on her third attempt she found the correct grave. "Mr. Spitz," she called out, "I think I found it. Come here." The elderly man slowly made his way between the crowded rows of graves, trying not to slip on the grassy, rain-slicked paths.
"Hello, my darling Leslie," he joyfully began,
kneeling right on the ground.
"You didn't want me to come again, and very wrongly so. You know, I'll find you anyway."
Karen examined the photograph on the monument. It showed an older but remarkably beautiful woman. There was something vaguely Eastern in her appearance, and her eyes seemed to laugh, filled with childlike joy. According to the date on the plaque, the woman had died 10 years ago, also on September the 6th, like Garry. What a coincidence, thought Karen. I wonder from what? She was not very old by age, probably ill. Suddenly the old man's voice broke the silence and interrupted her thoughts. His speech sounded in French. The last thing Karen expected to hear now was French poetry. Not just any poetry, but an excerpt from the famous poem by Rimbaud, which she had dedicated her thesis to. Karen automatically translated the last stanza spoken by Mr. Spitz. The old man froze, slowly turned his head towards her, and looked at the woman in wonder.
"Well, I see you like Rimbaud."
"You see," Karen blushed, sitting down on the bench. "In college I studied French, and this poem by Rimbaud was the topic of my thesis. To say that I was surprised to hear it now, here, and in excellent French is an understatement."
"And after this, how can one not believe that everything in the world happens for a reason? Karen, this verse, Leslie was literally obsessed with it. My wife knew French perfectly. In her youth she was fond of translating classics, and one day she came across Rimbaud. She read the translation, but it seemed to her that it did not convey the essence of the original at all. And Leslie was a very persistent and determined girl. Then she decided to create her own version of the translation. I have an old notebook at home where my spouse wrote down her versions, but she could not bring them to perfection, as she thought."
"I would be genuinely interested in taking a look," Karen said genuinely.
"Oh, please, if you are interested, then I invite you to visit. I live alone. My son married and moved abroad long ago, visits once every couple of years, and I am afraid to fly. I haven't even seen my grandchildren in person. Since Leslie passed away, I live as a recluse. If it's not too much trouble, come over. I live near the Central Library."
Karen nodded. Someone might find the old man's offer dubious, but the woman felt that this person was very lonely, and the sincerity with which he shared the details of his life was endearing. Moreover, Karen genuinely wanted to see the translations of Rimbaud. "I will definitely come. Let's say tomorrow at 5. Will that be convenient?"
Of course,
the elderly man assured her.
"Come over and I'll treat you to my signature coffee, according to an Algerian recipe."
The new acquaintances spent some time at the cemetery, after which Karen kindly offered to drive Mr. Spitz home. All the way, he told her about the peculiarities of growing flowers in a home greenhouse. Karen could not have imagined that it could be so interesting. The next evening, after finishing work, Karen called her eldest daughter and arranged for her to pick up Leela from kindergarten, warning that she might be a bit late. "Mum," Chiltern said over the phone, "you'll be late? Is it because of work, or are you going on a date?" "Oh, sweetie, it's not a date," Karen laughed. "I have a meeting scheduled. I'll try not to be too long, okay?" "Got it, Mum," Chiltern chirped. "Don't worry." On her way, Karen bought some pastries, as it felt awkward to visit someone empty-handed. Then she parked near an impressive entrance adorned with stucco, noting that the building where the old man lived was quite grand, even by modern standards. In the past, such buildings were home to the diplomats, academics and high-ranking officials. Today, only the very wealthy could afford an apartment in such an architectural gem. Mr. Spitz lived on the 7th and top floor, ascending in an antique elevator with a sliding iron grate. Karen admired the rich decor of the staircase landing. Ornate stucco adorned the walls, marble floors gleamed with cleanliness, and each door boasted a golden plaque with the residents' initials. Mr. Spitz greeted her with a broad smile. The old man was dressed in an impeccably fitting grey wool suit that made him look significantly younger.
"Good evening, dear Karen," he greeted her. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to come."
"Why not?" Karen asked, somewhat embarrassed.
"Well, you must agree, meeting at a cemetery is a rather dubious way to start a friendship."
The old man smiled.
"Although, considering how life flows these days, it's wonderful that strangers can even talk to each other and find a common topic."
"I confess," Karen replied, "I'm driven by professional interest, and I'm also very curious to try the coffee you raved about. I even brought some pastries."
"Thank you." Mr. Spitz took the proffered package of treats. "Please come in."
Karen entered a vast living room. The apartment had high ceilings, at least 4 meters tall. One wall of the spacious room was entirely lined with bookshelves, filled with rare editions that the library's owner had collected over decades. There were even some ancient, medieval-looking manuscripts and volumes with gold letters, worn by time, on their spines.
"I see you like my little collection,"
Mr. Spitz remarked, bringing in a tray with a coffee pot and sweets. "Little? There must be at least 2,000 volumes here," Karen responded, continuing to examine the books.
3,047, to be exact, the old man informed her. "There used to be more, but after Leslie's death I donated part of the collection to the university library, as she had wished. And now, even though I'm retired, I can't read as much as I used to. My eyesight isn't what it was. And, you know, it was more interesting to discuss what we'd read with Leslie. Sometimes I open her favourite, illustrated editions, and simply admire the pictures. Like this one."
Mr. Spitz reached for one of the shelves holding a collection of beautifully bound books with golden Arabic ornaments.
"The Arabian Nights,"
he presented, showing Karen an exquisitely beautiful book, silk-bound, with a glossy enamel inlay depicting Scheherazade in a blooming garden.
"This edition is from 1913 in French with illustrations."
"My goodness, it's gorgeous!" Karen exclaimed in admiration. "I would never have thought that such specimens are kept in private collections. This is a true work of art."
"You're right," the old man smiled. "Such collections can easily be sold at auctions for a decent amount of money. Today there are no more than 5 complete collections of exactly these books, but I would not sell them for any money. You see, they are not just well-preserved volumes. This is memory, moments of happiness, gone forever, but also forever remaining in my soul. Leslie and I brought this collection in Paris, believe it or not, for 300 francs. Although at that time This sum seemed fabulous to us. We had only 300 francs left. Seeing how my wife's eyes were burning, the seller could not resist and gave in. Probably he regretted it 1,000,000 times later. After all, today the cost of such a collection is at least 30,000 euros.
No way, Karen marvelled. Really?
True story, the old man sighed. But what's the use of money if you can't buy anything with it? Think about it. Where would an old man like me need such a sum? But why? For the funeral, perhaps, but I'm not some pharaoh.
Karen laughed. Mr. Spitz was right. She wondered what she would do if she owned such valuable books. Probably she would sell them without a second thought. She needed the money to raise her children. Every penny counted. But if the books belonged to her children, then no, not for any money. Mr. Spitz, she began, sipping coffee from an elegant porcelain cup. This coffee is amazing. I've never tasted anything like it.
Ah, the elderly man laughed. I'm glad you appreciated my signature recipe, although calling it mine is not entirely correct. I learned to make coffee this way from an old Arab named Amin. His coffee shop was located in one of the old quarters. Arabs greatly value coffee. For them, it's not just a drink, but a whole culture.
How interesting, Karen exclaimed. And have you travelled a lot?
A lot, the old man sighed. Well, Algeria is a special topic for me. You see, Leslie worked as a translator in the embassy. That's where Leslie and I met. I was an archaeologist, and once we set off to Africa. At first, of course, everything seemed wild, especially the unbearable heat and the lack of familiar comforts. We went to the mountains. It was very difficult to get there. We had to carry all our luggage, provisions, and equipment ourselves. After taking several hundred photographs, filling dozens of journals, and carefully packing their equipment, we were ready to set off on their return journey the next morning. The last night we built fires, prepared dinner, and sat down to tell stories from life which quickly became boring. Then our translator started pestering Said to tell them something about this place, something he had personally encountered. The guide refused for a long time, but after persistent persuasion his tongue loosened. I had just started leading scholars to the ruins. The man began in French. My first group consisted of 4 young Frenchmen. Among them was a photographer. One evening, one of the guys noticed that Eugene was missing. We split into pairs and continued the search. I went into the mountains with Françoise, and the other 2 guys headed to explore the ruins. When dawn broke, Françoise and I returned to the camp and saw Luc, one of the guys who had gone to the ruins, was running towards us. He ran after him towards the amphitheatre. There, on the steps, sat Eugene. His head was as white as chalk, although just yesterday he had been a dark-haired brunette. He was clutching his camera tightly and muttering only one word. No! It seemed as if the guy couldn't see or hear anything around him. His pupils were dilated and his lips were cracked. 2 days later, he seemed to have come to his senses, but he remembered nothing. As soon as the guys left, I heard nothing more about them. After Said finished his story, the silence around the campfire was broken by Sam. Among us, he was the only one who believed in the existence of otherworldly forces. You know, last night I went out of the tent to relieve myself, and right around the amphitheatre I saw some kind of glow. Maybe there really are ghosts there. Come on, Sam, what ghosts? I said to him. I didn't believe in it, but for some reason I couldn't sleep peacefully after what I had heard. When all of the guys had gone to their tents, I tossed and turned for a long time, wondering what the Frenchman could have seen in the ruins that made him go crazy instantly. Suddenly my thoughts were interrupted by a crackling sound from the street. I stuck my head out of the tent, but there was no one around. Only the embers of the campfire were slowly dying out. I was about to climb back in when the crackling sounded again. The sound was loud and clear, coming from the direction of the ruins. "No way," I muttered, climbing out of the tent. "Whatever is there, the sound is clearly not from the other world." Armed with a powerful flashlight and a sturdy stick, I headed towards the amphitheatre. There was someone in the centre of the structure. I froze, not understanding how a person could be there. But the figure was wearing something light that covered almost the entire body. I gripped the stick tighter and shone the light on the person sitting below. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I shouted. Suddenly, the figure quickly stood up and turned around. The flashlight illuminated a woman's face covered in blood. I stepped back, paralyzed with fear. The woman silently stared at me. "Who are you?" I stammered. "Do you want help? We have a first aid kit. I'll bring it right now. Just don't go anywhere." I was about to leave when the woman suddenly grabbed my arm and spoke to me in perfect English. "You're not a hallucination? You're real? I had given up hope for help. You see, our caravan was attacked. We were heading to the settlement, but on the way, we fell into a trap. Some people pulled us out of the cars, started pushing us roughly, trying to put us in their truck. I managed to escape, but as you see, it gets dark quickly. I know the city is not far, but I'm completely disoriented. I stumbled upon these ruins and decided to wait out the night, but it's freezing. If it weren't for you, I think I would have frozen to death by morning." Only now did I notice that the stranger was wearing a silk business suit, dirty and torn in places. "Good Lord, let's go to our camp quickly. Can you walk?" I asked, supporting the woman by the arm. "I think I can walk, yes," she replied, "but I think my heel broke." I helped my companion get to the camp, rekindled the fire and sat her on a folding stool. From the tent, I took out 2 blankets and a first aid kit. While treating the wound on the stranger's face, I noticed that she was very young, no more than 25 years old. No one got any more sleep that night. At first everyone listened to the story of the stranger's appearance in the camp, and then the remaining few hours went by on guard duty. In the morning, we loaded our gear onto the mules and set off for the city. In the capital, Leslie saw me off to her flight, but before boarding we exchanged addresses and phone numbers. And a year later, she returned to our homeland. By that time, a real feeling had arisen between us, To please my beloved, I even began to learn French. Leslie was transferred to the consulate. She sometimes had to go to North Africa, but she spent most of her time in the country. After 2 years, we got married. Leslie shared all my interests, inspiring love for her own, so we always had something to talk about. Heated arguments were sparked by discussions of literature. Leslie passionately collected books, and if I preferred history and architecture, she grabbed every volume of poetry she could find. For our honeymoon, we managed to go not just anywhere, but to France. My beloved wife dragged me to flea markets, museums, and cosy cafes. And at night, we would take long walks along the Seine and dream about the future, savouring the present. A year later, we had a son. Leslie was overjoyed. She inherited this apartment in the city centre from her father, where the couple moved immediately. I was swamped with work. I was sent to the distant region, where large-scale excavations of ancient settlements were taking place. For 5 years, I was home for a maximum of 2 months a year. Leslie took on most of the responsibility for raising our son, but even such long absences could not spoil the relationship between us. During those rare days when I was home, I tried to make up for the entire period of my absence. I organised large-scale excursions around the city, took them out into nature and created fantastic costume performances at home. And I still passionately argued with my wife about literary preferences. Finally, my voluntary exile ended and I breathed a sigh of relief. I was already heading an archaeological department at the university. I rarely went out into the field, buried in paperwork. Leslie continued to work at the consulate, where she remained after maternity leave. She didn't even have to worry about her job. There were very few specialists like her. We never quarrelled, and it simply did not occur to us how to quarrel, living soul to soul. Our son studied at college in Canada, then found a job in England, married happily and only occasionally visited us. By this time I found an interesting niche for myself, consulting and organising private archaeological expeditions, the demand for which had sharply increased by the 2000s. My wife, who by that time had celebrated her 50th birthday, left the civil service, engaged in tutoring. She enjoyed teaching students French, and the youth listened with interest to her stories about wonderful travels in French-speaking countries. And then the terrible happened. Leslie had a stroke. She was completely paralysed on the right side of her body. I was away at the time, and I found out about it over the phone and immediately dropped everything to return to my beloved wife as soon as possible. After a long period of rehabilitation, Leslie's mobility never returned. The stroke severely affected her speech. For me, it only mattered that she was alive, but to Leslie, it seemed that such an existence could not be called life. At some point, she became very distant, refusing my help, so I had to hire a caregiver. In rare moments when Leslie's mood improved, I would go into her room and read her Arabian tales for a long time. She cried, and I was confused, understanding that I was completely helpless in this situation. This went on for a long 10 years, and then one morning, on September the 6th, I, as usual, went into my wife's bedroom to wish her a good morning, but, to my horror, found her dead. Leslie had passed away in her sleep. Her face was peaceful and even somewhat happy. The funeral was lavish. To say goodbye to Leslie, all her former colleagues and many friends came. Her death crushed me. I withdrew into myself, ceasing all social contacts. Without Leslie, the part of me that made me enjoy every day had gone. My son urged me to move to him, but such a thing was unacceptable. Soon I became engrossed in gardening, growing my late wife's favourite flowers, lavender, in my indoor greenhouse, and every year I brought fragrant bouquets to her grave. Having finished his story, the old man sighed heavily. Karen saw that the memories brought him unbearable pain. It's been 10 years since she's gone, but every time I hope to hear her voice again, he said. I know what that's like, Karen replied. My story may not be as romantic, but when my husband passed away, my world turned upside down. For 4 years now, I've been trying to cope with the loss, but I still can't get used to the fact that he's no longer here. Karen, Mr. Spitz addressed her, thank you for listening to an old man's story. You are the first person I have been able to talk to so openly in the last 10 years. And you know, I feel lighter, as if you have taken a burden off me. Mr. Spitz, Karen suddenly suggested, why don't you come visit us this Sunday? It's my son's birthday. I would very much like for you to meet the children. Karen felt sorry for the lonely old man, locked in this huge apartment, alone with his tormenting memories of his wife. She liked him very much, so she found it appropriate to invite him to the family celebration. I don't know, Mr. Spitz replied uncertainly. Won't I be a bother? Of course not, Karen hurried to reassure him. You're such an interesting person. I think both you and my children would enjoy getting to know each other. And you and I have plenty to talk about. Honestly, I can't stand seeing you suffer. Please come. All right, the elderly man smiled in response. I will come. From that day on,
Mr. Spitz became a frequent guest in Karen's apartment. The children immediately liked the elegant and talkative old man, who had stories for every occasion. They spent hours listening to his tales of expeditions and travels to other countries. Often Mr. Spitz would invite them to his place. Chilton was captivated by their library. Together with Leela, they read French fairy tales, looking at antique engravings that depicted the plots. The old man, or rather Grandpa, as they called him, treated the children to sweets and showed them marvellous things brought from abroad by him and Leslie. Karen was happy that such a friend had appeared in their family. They constantly chatted with Mr. Spitz, sitting over coffee, discussing everything that came to mind. As an interlocutor, the old man had no equal. He literally knew everything about everything. Gradually, Karen shed the heavy burden of her past. One day, on a weekend, Mr. Spitz came to visit and immediately took Karen aside.
"Karen," he began, "we've been talking for a long time now, and I admire how much you love life. I see how hard it is for you to raise these wonderful children alone. Tell me honestly, are you satisfied with your life?"
"I don't understand you, Mr. Spitz," Karen replied, confused. "Of course I am satisfied. I have wonderful children and a roof over my head. And now such a friend has appeared in my life. How can I complain?"
"A fine response, Karen," the elderly man smiled. "But that is not what I meant. Let us be direct. Do you have enough to live on?"
Karen opened her mouth, unsure of how to respond. They had never discussed financial matters. Indeed, Mr. Spitz knew that she worked as a manager in a small company. She had never disclosed her salary, but it was easy to guess that money was barely enough to support such a large family. The apartment desperately needed repairs, and the car was practically screaming for urgent attention. But did any of that matter?
"Karen," Mr. Spitz continued seriously, "you may not say anything, but I am not a fool. I see that you are struggling, and to be honest, it is painful to watch such a talented and versatile person waste away in a dead-end job. Therefore, I want to make you an offer. I have spoken with some old acquaintances. Tell me, would you like to work in your field? A large pharmaceutical company is urgently seeking a translator from French. Believe me, they will welcome you with open arms."
"But I have almost forgotten the language," Karen murmured, embarrassed.
"Nonsense," Mr. Spitz hastened to reassure her. "You speak excellently, without any accent. I know what I am talking about. If you agree, come for an interview tomorrow. It is more of a formality, but you need to come and meet them."
"Mr. Spitz!" Karen could not believe what she was hearing. "If you are serious, then of course I agree." Karen loved her new job. She constantly communicated with interesting people and frequently travelled to France, accompanying her boss. She had been in her position for 2.5 years. During this time, she managed to improve her life significantly. She was able to transfer her children to a prestigious school. The constant financial problems seemed to disappear on their own. Even her personal life took on a certain improvement. One of her colleagues showed a clear affection for her, which, to Karen's surprise, she found herself reciprocating. Then one night, her phone rang. Through her sleep, she did not immediately grasp the meaning of what she heard. An unfamiliar voice informed her that Mr. Spitz had passed away that day. The elderly man had gone quietly in his sleep. His heart had just stopped. Karen wept. Over the past years, this elderly man had become a true friend to her, even more, a dear one. But his passing did not cause hysteria. She was glad that, finally, this man would meet his beloved somewhere in heaven, which he stubbornly refused to believe in with his mind, but acknowledged with his heart. Karen helped with the funeral arrangements. While cleaning his apartment, she found a letter addressed to her, which Mr. Spitz had apparently written shortly before his death. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and took out a sheet of paper, covered in neat handwriting.
Dear Karen, I did not want to upset you prematurely, but I feel that I do not have much time left. I am glad that towards the end of my days, life has regained its colours. You and your children are a true miracle. I have done everything possible to help you overcome what was hindering you from breathing freely. I want everything to work out for you in the future, so that nothing prevents you from growing and loving life. Therefore, I ask you to accept my modest gift for Chilton, Andrew and Leela, because I know you would refuse it for yourself. With sincerest respect and love, Mark Spitz.
Karen fidgeted with the sheet of paper, not understanding what Mr. Spitz meant. She felt both joy and sorrow at receiving such a message from him after his passing. Soon, Karen forgot about the letter and became engrossed in the whirlwind of everyday life. Imagine her surprise when, 6 months later, a notary called and invited her to attend the reading of Mr. Spitz's will. At the appointed hour, on September the 6th, the woman entered his office, where she was informed that the deceased's last will was to bequeath his apartment to Chilton, Andrew and Leela, and the library contained within it to their mother, Karen.